Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation about the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC here in New York City. Our firm does focus on business immigration law. The TN visa is one of the most common visas that we handle. So we have extensive experience preparing these, though I do want to point out that our firm does handle the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So whether you have questions about business immigration options, family-based options, other temporary visas like student visas, visitor visas, we would be very happy to help. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. A few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have a question, please do send it in through either the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom. I will be monitoring those throughout the presentation. I'll probably save questions for the end, but I do plan to get to all questions by the end, so don't hesitate to send those my way. Also, we try to do at least one webinar a week. And again, these do span the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So we do hope you'll be joining us for other presentations. After this presentation, we'll send an email that has a link where you can sign up for our future webinars, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint that you see on your screen. So no need to take extensive notes. We will be sharing the presentation with you. Also, the email that you get after this presentation will have a link to our YouTube channel as well as our blog. And we're very proud to put high quality information on both our YouTube channel as well as our blog, obviously completely free. We hope you'll take advantage of that and use that. Along the same lines, this presentation is being recorded, and we will be posting the full-length webinar to our YouTube channel, so please do keep that in mind. The last thing I want to say is that I think unique to our firm is the fact that our founding attorney, Ian Scott, has personally navigated the process of several visas, including the TN visa, which we'll be talking about today. And his experience navigating that really does inform the way that we work with our clients. Our firm was founded on a visa, an E2 visa, and is currently still, Ian is still on an E2 visa. So we're not only immigration lawyers familiar with the regulations, the statutes, all of the laws, the policies, but we also are able to see the application process through the applicant's eyes, thanks to Ian's experience. So I think that really does help us stand apart. Without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. As just very brief background about the TN visa, part of the reason why it's one of the most common visas that our firm handles is because if you are a national of Canada or Mexico, meaning you have a passport from one of those two countries, there really are fewer, more straightforward, simpler, and faster options to get a visa to work in the United States. The TN visa was established through NAFTA, through the agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And really, the idea was to streamline the process to allow people to work between those three countries. So if you do hold a passport from Canada or Mexico and you meet the qualifications, which we'll talk about, really the TN does tend to be the ideal option. Though I will say, we won't be getting into specific circumstances during this webinar. We won't be responding to individual audience members' scenarios. So if you do have questions about what option is best for you, whether the TN is ideal, please do schedule a consultation. We'd be happy to talk through what your goals are, what your circumstances are, and what the ideal visa fit might be. So what are the TN visa requirements? The first, which I already mentioned, you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. And that does not mean you need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. You only need to hold a passport from Canada or Mexico. So if you were born in India and you naturalized in Canada, you're eligible as long as you have a Canadian passport. Second of all, you must be coming to the United States to work in one of a list of professions. So I am going to be, you see on the screen, it mentions the TN regulations. I am going to pull that up right now, and I recommend if you're at a computer, it's worthwhile to pull that up as well. So if we search NAFTA TN regulations, a little bit down the page, you'll see 8 CFR 214.6. If you click on that, those are the NAFTA TN regulations. You'll actually see a list of professions. It starts with accountant, and then architect, computer systems analyst. As you scroll down, you see medical professions, dentists, dietitians, nutritionists. You see scientists, geochemists, teachers, college, seminary, and university teachers. So there are literally dozens of professions listed in the TN regulations. You do need to be coming to the US to work in one of those professions if you're going to get a TN visa. But importantly, there are professions that are left out. So there's no, say, marketing role. So, you know, even though there are dozens of professions, do make sure that you fall into one of them. Second of all, you must qualify for the specific profession that you're coming to the US to work in. So what does that mean? Again, if we look at the regulations, after each profession, you see the qualification requirement. And when I say qualification, I'm not saying how you qualify based on what the US employer wants. A US employer might want 20 years of experience. That's not what I'm referring to. I am referring to the NAFTA qualification. So the regulations actually say what the qualification is for each profession. So if we look at accountant, for example, you see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a professional license, a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So for an accountant, you can qualify based on an undergraduate degree or a professional license. For, let's say, economist, you qualify based on a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So economists can only qualify based on an undergraduate degree. If you do have a master's degree or a PhD, that's fine as well. But you cannot qualify as an economist based on professional experience alone. You do need that degree. If we look finally at management consultant, we see you can qualify based on a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience as established by at least 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So management consultants can qualify based on an undergraduate degree or experience. So you see how each profession has a different qualification requirement. And again, those are defined in the regulations. I'll quickly say when you see that a degree is a requirement, so if we go back to economist, you see the baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. That's the only way that you can qualify as an economist for a TN visa is having that degree. The degree, the government takes the position that the degree does need to be related to the profession. Even though that is not written in the regulations, the government will take that position. So if we take the example of economist, what is a related degree? Well, if you have an undergraduate degree in economics, you clearly satisfy the requirement. If you have an undergraduate degree in English or, literature, that is going to be very difficult to qualify based on. So what you need to think about and what we do help our clients think through is there a way to make the argument that your degree is somehow related? So what we would do in a case like the person with an English degree is ask, for example, did you take any courses in economics? Can you provide your transcript? And does your transcript have economics courses? Might it be possible to get a letter from your thesis advisor if you did independent research, for example, in economics? If you have a degree in English, obviously extremely unlikely that you did a thesis in economics, but what if your degree is in math or statistics or finance? Those are all a little closer to economics, and you may have done independent research or written a thesis on a topic related to economics. And so letters from your thesis advisor or from an academic advisor may be persuasive there. So, again, if your degree is in English and you're applying to work as an economist, it's going to be a hard sell. But if your degree is in finance, if your degree is in math, statistics, and you did take courses related to economics, you may very well be able to make the argument. I'll use this opportunity to also refer to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH. So if you're at your computer and you Google OOH and then economist, what the Occupational Outlook Handbook is a publication by the U.S. Department of Labor. And the OOH lists dozens of jobs. And they actually, for each job, and you can see this if you go to the Economist page, at the top of the page, you see a list of tabs. So there is a tab that says how to become one. And you'll see there that that it says, let me see if I can find the specific, yes. So education. Economists typically need a master's degree. Positions in business research or international organization may require a master's degree. A bachelor's degree can be sufficient. That's fine. But then the reason I'm raising this is that they mention that you may have a related degree in mathematics, and in some other jobs, it may actually, excuse me, not be economists. But it does talk about related fields, that to go into this profession, sometimes employers will accept a related degree. So the OOH is a resource for you to go to, and I will talk about OOH throughout this presentation, where you can actually look at the information there and potentially make the argument that your related degree is actually sufficient. So just to take an example, you could make the argument that I have a degree in math. The OOH refers to coursework in math, and I've also taken coursework in economics. Therefore, my degree is sufficient. All right, let's go to the next requirement. You must have a pre-arranged job in the United States for a defined length of time with an employer in the United States. So what this means is you cannot apply for a TN visa to search for a job. You actually already need to have a job offer in hand from a U.S. employer. A U.S. employer, fortunately, is very broadly defined. It can be an LLC, it can be a corporation, it can be a sole proprietorship, just one person who has a business. As long as they have given you a job offer, and the moment that you enter the U.S. in TN status, you have a job available to you, that satisfies this requirement. We will talk about how to document this in the application, which really is a letter from the employer. The U.S. employer really is at the heart. It's in many ways one of the most important pieces of a TN application, and we'll talk more in the presentation about what that letter should say. But it will define the length of time, the salary, the job duties, and the specific TN profession you'll be coming to the U.S. to do, and how you qualify for it. Next, in that job, the job you're coming to the U.S. to perform, you must be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with the listed profession. This is very important. So to basically, to say this differently, if you're coming to the US in a specific TN occupation, your job duties in the US need to be consistent with what the government thinks someone in that role does. So let's take the example of an economist, and we'll talk about economists more a bit later, because the government has specifically defined what economists do, what the government thinks economists do. If you go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you'll see another tab at the top of the page that says what they do. So if you click that, it says what economists do, and it has a list of job duties. Economists typically do the following. They research economic issues, they conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, statistical tools. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals on fiscal policy, economic topics, and they present their research. And then it has several paragraphs talking about additional job duties that economists might have. If you're applying to come to the US, as an example, as an economist on a TN visa, you need to make sure that your job duties are aligned with these, because these job duties on the Occupational Outlook Handbook are the government's idea of what an economist does. If you show up at the consulate or at the border and you say, I want to come into the US as an economist, and your job duties are something that's different from this. So, for example, if your job in the US is going to be setting up social media accounts for a company and advertising the company, there is a very good chance that the government officer is going to say, I'm looking at your job duties in the US, you're going to be working in marketing. What economists actually do based on the Occupational Outlook Handbook is different from that. Therefore, I'm not going to grant you the TN visa. So you really do want to make sure that your job duties are aligned. And again, the Occupational Outlook Handbook has dozens and dozens of occupations. So whichever occupation you're coming to the US to perform on a TN, you do want to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and just make sure your job duties, the job duties you'll be performing in the US, are consistent with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says someone in that job does. And finally, the degree must match the job description. And we've already talked about that, that the examiner will look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook to figure out what degree is required and what that profession does. So the alignment of the job duties, the degree, and the profession, which we already talked about. This is just a screenshot of the Occupational Outlook Handbook. Again, key resource in TN visas. We use it extensively, and it's very accessible, quite easy to navigate. So we recommend that you use it as well as you're figuring out what job opportunity you're looking for, whether you qualify based on the regulations, and whether your job duties are aligned. One of the most common questions we get is actually from employers in the US, which is, does the TN visa require sponsorship? Sponsorship is a term in US immigration law that is first important to define because different people have different ideas of what it means. When an employer is asking if a visa requires sponsorship, what they usually have in mind is what's required for, say, an employment-based green card or for an H-1B visa, for example. Sponsorship is quite a hefty requirement for US employers. So sponsorship requires that the US employer test the US labor market, advertise the job, see if there are qualified US workers who are willing and able to take the job. And if there are, then they can't hire someone on a visa. It requires that the US employer pay a prevailing wage, which is higher than the minimum wage typically. It requires that the US employer in many cases pay for the return travel if the person's job doesn't work out. So there are a number of requirements in regarding sponsorship that are applied to the US employer. TN visas do not have those requirements. The TN visa, really the only requirement that applies to the US employer is that the US employer write a letter. Obviously, it needs to be honest, it needs to be accurate. That explains who the US employer is, why they need someone to fill this role, who you are as the applicant, what your qualifications are, what your job duties will be in the United States, how much they expect to pay you, how long they expect to employ you, and they need to sign that letter and put it on their company letterhead. That is really all that's required of the US employer. There is no prevailing wage requirement. There is no requirement that they test the labor market. They don't need to know if they're permanent residents or US citizens or other US workers able to fill the job. None of those requirements apply. And for that reason, we regularly will say that the TN visa does not require sponsorship. If you come across an employer that just doesn't understand this, many employers, they have their systems and they, their HR people oftentimes may not understand what sponsorship actually is. We are very happy to speak with them, if you'd like us to do a consultation with them, with you and them oftentimes on the line as well, whatever your preference is, we're happy to do that. And we do that with some regularity. But we feel quite strongly that TN visas do not require sponsorship as that term is defined in US immigration law. Again, this is part of the reason why TN visas are so popular, is that they really are one of the most streamlined, fastest options for US employers to employ someone from Canada or Mexico. And a large part of that is because they don't require sponsorship. So one very minor slight caveat to that is if the employee, if the prospective employee is already in the United States, let's say they are on a student visa in the United States and they are applying to change their status within the United States to TN status. So they're not going to a consulate to get the TN visa, and they're not going to a port of entry, then the application is filed with USCIS, and the employer will sign that form. It's called a Form I-129. So the application is filed by the employer. However, that does not change the requirements or responsibilities on the US employer. Everything I said before is still the same. They don't need to test the labor market. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage. They only need to sign a letter and sign the forms if the application's going to USCIS. So very slight caveat. So there are some differences in the application process for nationals of Canada and Mexico. So again, the TN visa is only available for those who have a passport from either Canada or Mexico. Canadians have 3 options to apply for a TN visa. The 2 of those 3 options are also available to nationals of Mexico. Let's start with the option that is not available to nationals of Mexico. Canadians can apply at a port of entry. So they can leave the United States and apply for the visa either at an airport or a land crossing with US Customs and Border Protection. Almost all of our clients from Canada will apply for TN status through a port of entry. The reason is that it is very fast. You get an immediate decision. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's straightforward. You really just need to approach the U.S. Customs and Border Protection officer with your TN application. We'll talk about what that entails. Have a brief conversation, explain what the job is, how you qualify, and then you're granted TN status upon your entry in the United States. You can begin working. It's quite a simple and straightforward process. So that's option 1, applying at a port of entry. Option 2 is applying at a U.S. consulate abroad. Canadians do have this option. They rarely use it because the port of entry option is so easy. One of the few instances in which a Canadian would want to do this is if they have a dependent spouse or a dependent child who does not have a Canadian passport. Excuse me. If that's the case, then the spouse or child will need to apply at a consulate, and oftentimes the TN applicant will then say, you know what, I want us to apply together at the consulate. So that is one of the few instances when a Canadian will apply at the consulate. The final option, and again, this option does apply to nationals of Mexico as well, is if the individual is inside the US and they would, or the US employer would file the I-129 to with USCIS to change status to TN status. So those are the 3 options: port of entry, consulate, and USCIS. Only Canadians can apply at the port of entry. Nationals of Mexico must apply either at a consulate or USCIS. The visa can be issued for Canadians for 3 years. Nationals of Mexico do have the option to get a 4-year TN visa, which in most cases is the best option. It saves you from going back to the consulate. Now, each time you enter the US, regardless of how long the visa is for, whether it's 3 years or 4 years, whether the visa is valid for 3 years or 4 years, each time you enter the US, you are given 3 years of TN status, which means that you can stay in the US for 3 years before you have to leave the US. If you have a 4-year visa, then you can leave after those 3 years and come back in, and the Customs and Border Protection officer can decide how much time you get, but typically it is 3 years. But if you do have a question about the difference between visa validity and status, I'm happy to walk through that. And in Mexico, nationals of Mexico, the consulates there will sometimes allow renewals to be done through mail. The way that works is you'd submit your application to renew to the consulate, and they will let you know if you qualify for an interview waiver and can apply through the mail. You do need to be in Mexico, though, to apply through the mail. You always need to be in the jurisdiction of the consulate. All right. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about two particularly difficult TN occupational categories or professions. I mentioned before that there are dozens of TN professions, from accountants to management consultants, professors. There really are dozens. Some are more difficult than others. Two that are particularly difficult are management consultants and economists. So they're difficult for completely different reasons. So let's talk about first management consultants. If you remember, when we were talking through the qualifications that are listed in the TN regulations, management consultants can qualify based on having a bachelor's, an undergraduate degree, or experience. So you do not need a degree to qualify as a management consultant. There are really only one or two professions in the TN regulations that don't require either a degree or a professional license, which itself will oftentimes require a degree. So if you don't have a degree, you're going to fall into oftentimes the management consulting category. And the government knows that. The government knows that people who otherwise wouldn't qualify as a management consultant will apply in that category just because they don't have a degree. And so they really scrutinize that category. Um, there are ways to strengthen a management consulting category, but let's start by making clear that management consultant applications really do fall along a spectrum. Not all of them are difficult. The ones that are easy are if you are working or planning to work in the United States as a management consultant at a management consulting firm. So if you're coming to the US to work for McKinsey, Bain, BCG, Oliver Wyman, any number of these consulting firms, then those are fairly straightforward applications. Obviously you do need to qualify. You need either the undergraduate degree that's related to the job. For management consultants, it's business, could be economics, arguably finance, something like that, maybe a related degree, or 5 years of experience as a management consultant. At the other end of the spectrum, what really are challenging management consulting applications are when the US employer is not a management consulting firm. I like to use the example of a company in the US that designs and manufactures solar panels. So let's say that you are a national of Mexico. You don't have an undergraduate degree, but you have 10 years of experience in the solar panel industry. You really are an expert in solar panels, designing them, maybe selling them. And you are applying to come to the US to advise that solar panel company on how it can improve its operations, its design, its manufacturing of solar panels. How would you, that would be a risky management consultant application. And that being said, though, there are ways to strengthen the application. So how would you strengthen that application? Really, the overarching way in which you would strengthen that application is to make sure that it really does look like what a management consulting relationship looks like. So what do I mean by that? Management consultants are hired to advise on a specific challenge that a company is facing. They're not hired for years typically. Usually it is a short period of time. There's a very well-defined challenge. They are qualified to advise on that challenge. They do so, they deliver the advice. Sometimes they monitor the implementation of that advice, and then they're gone. They are not a full-time, W-2 employee. They're typically a contractor, or their consulting company is paid for their services. That's really what the TN application should look like. So if we go back to our example of the solar panel company, what would be important to do in that application, and again, all of this needs to actually be accurate. So what I'm about to say assumes that the person is actually going to be doing this in the US. So the application would have the solar panel company defining the specific challenge that they're facing. It would also talk about how this applicant, TN applicant, is uniquely qualified to advise on that challenge. It would talk about the deliverables. So in other words, at a certain period of time, so say after 3 months, the consultant is going to deliver a report, or is going to observe over those 3 months. They're going to be compensated based on the amount of time they're observing, or recommendations that they deliver to management. Stage 2 is going to be actually speaking with management and delivering reports and analysis of data. Stage 3 is going to be them monitoring the implementation of their recommendations, and they're going to be paid, based on, certain deliverables. That all would be outlined in, say, a consulting agreement, where it is a contract between the U.S. employer and either the consultant, the individual, or if the individual has a consulting firm abroad, not inside the U.S. but abroad, then the contract is with the consulting firm abroad. But it really does look like this is a real management consulting agreement. The person is being paid based on deliverables, not paid based on being at the office at 8 a.m. and leaving at 5 p.m., hitting a certain number of hours. They are also only working within the scope of the problem that's defined. So management consulting applications oftentimes are shorter than 3 years. They may be 2 years or even 1 year, because it doesn't take 3 years for the person to analyze the specific problem and present the deliverables on it. Also, you typically you do need to show that the role is supernumerary. That's a word that is not a common word, but it is a word that does appear in government policy on the TN. What it means is that the role really is not a full-time position at the company that the person's coming to fill. It would be odd. It would look odd if a company hires a management consultant to fill a full-time role at the company. Typically, management consultants are independent contractors. And so if you do have an independent contractor agreement, a consulting agreement that makes it clear that this is not an employee, this is an independent contractor, that can also strengthen the application. So in general, what you want to keep in mind is that the engagement really does need to look like a typical management consultant arrangement. If it doesn't, if it looks like full-time employment, that is very likely to raise flags. So let's shift gears and talk about the economist role. The reason this role is challenging is completely different from the management consulting role. Basically, in 2017, the government issued a policy memo that narrowed the definition of what the government thinks economists do. So before, I mentioned you want to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, look at its list of job duties for economists. That is especially important for economists. You want to do that for any role, but it's especially important for economists because government officials have been directed to specifically look at economist applications and make sure they're complying with the job duties. what this policy memo said is that uh, economists do not work as financial analysts or market research analysts. So, what does that mean? That means if you're coming to the US to work as a financial analyst, you can look that up on the Occupational Outlook Handbook to see what job duties they have. They basically are advising companies on how to generate profit through investments. Market research analysts are really marketing specialists. They're looking at how to market companies. So if you're coming to the US to do either of those two roles, you are very likely facing a denial. I won't say that you can't apply for a TN. It might work as a management consultant application, but you do need to be aware that fitting that within the economist category is going to receive scrutiny. So again, rely on the Occupational Outlook Handbook for a description of the job duties and make sure that your profession is aligned. It's especially important for economists. Let's shift gears again and walk through the details of the application process. I already mentioned that nationals of Canada and Mexico have different pathways to apply for a TN visa. So I'll go quite quickly through a lot of this. Nationals of Canada can apply at a port of entry, airports, land crossings. Nationals of Mexico cannot. Nationals of Mexico need to already have a TN visa if they are going to enter through in TN status through a port of entry, and they need to get that TN visa at a consulate. So to apply for a TN visa, let's go with Canadians applying at a port of entry. They would provide a job offer letter. That's a letter from the U.S. employer, as well as supporting documents that show that they have the required citizenship. So they would have their Canadian or Mexican passport, that they qualify, they meet the TN qualifications. So if you're qualifying based on your undergraduate degree, you would bring that degree with you, the original diploma. I know it sounds strange, but you do want to bring original documents to the consulate or the port of entry. If you're qualifying based on experience, you want to bring letters from your past employers that are on their letterheads, that have their original signatures, that talk about how you have at least 5 years of experience or the required experience for to qualify. If you're qualifying based on a professional license, you want to bring that actual license, the original license. The reason why you want to bring originals is that the consulate and ports of entry do face a high level of fraud. So they're very sensitive to fraudulent documents. If you have copies instead of originals, they are very likely to reject your application and tell you need originals. So don't invest all that time and energy only to be rejected for not having original documents. Some ports of entry, again, this is for Canadians, are optimized for faster TN processing. So for first-time applicants, it's oftentimes a good idea to go online, research which ports of entry are TN optimized, and use one of those ports of entry. We're also happy to help our clients navigate that. So always do call ahead though. During COVID, ports of entry would change their hours and would have unique procedures at different ports of entry. So that even though the ports of entry are now operating on standard hours by and large, it is still worthwhile to call ahead. I actually heard just last week from someone who scheduled a consultation with me and said that they went to a port of entry along the US-Canada border and were turned around because the wait list is a week and a half. You need to actually sign up before you go. They hadn't called ahead, so they didn't know that. So do call ahead and just make sure you're aware of what the procedures are before you show up. For nationals of Mexico, again, you must apply at a U.S. consulate or USCIS. We'll talk about that in a moment. The process, if you're applying at a consulate, is you would first file a DS-160 form, which is an online form with the consulate. They will then reach out to schedule your biometrics, fingerprints, photos. and call you in for an interview for the visa. You would explain to them what the job is, how you qualify, who the US employer is. And then if you're approved, you will receive an actual visa in your passport. And with that, you can enter the US in TN status. I mentioned before, if you are renewing your TN visa, sometimes the consulate will let you know you qualify for an interview waiver, which is very convenient. That means that you do need to be in Mexico, but you can mail your passport to the consulate and get the stamp mailed back to you, so you don't have to physically go and be interviewed. And finally, the third category on your screen is applying from within the US with USCIS. So Mexicans and Canadians can do this. They do need to already be in the US in status. So whether that is student status, visitor status, the US employer would file a form I-129 with USCIS requesting that the person's status be changed to TN status. The same application packet, and I should have said this before, what I described before for nationals of Canada applying at the border, how they need the employer letter, they need proof of qualification. Those same documents, the originals would be brought to the consulate by nationals of Mexico. Again, original documents of all of that. For USCIS applicants, the same documents would be submitted, but copies are okay. USCIS typically does not want to receive originals. So you can file copies with USCIS, but they would be copies of the same documents. So how you qualify, the employer letter, a copy of your passport, etc. Some common tips and pitfalls, and I'll just say we are coming to the end of the presentation, so please feel free to send in any questions. I already mentioned a few of these. It's always a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry just to make sure they're open when you plan to arrive and that you know if they have any unique procedures. It's a good idea to have the prospective US employer, the person who signs the employer letter, to have their phone on them when you plan to apply for the visa. So that's either if you're Canadian applying at the port of entry, or if you're a national of Mexico going to the consulate. Let your US employer know when you plan to be in the interview and to have their phone on them at that time, because sometimes government officials will call the author of the letter really just to verify that it's legitimate. Again, they encounter a lot of fraud. So sometimes they just pick up the phone to make sure that the job offer is legitimate and there really is a person behind the signature. As I mentioned before, bring your diploma, transcripts, diploma if you're qualifying based on the degree, transcripts if the degree is related, original signed version of the employer letter. These need to be original documents if you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate. If you're qualifying based on experience, original letters from the employer. Again, USCIS, you can file copies, but ports of entry and consulates, you need those originals. Excuse me. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa, meaning it is temporary. So you do need to be prepared to convince the officer that you plan to leave at the end of the visa. How do you do this? You can do this by showing your ties abroad. If you have a bank account in Mexico or Canada, you can bring a copy of your bank statement showing you have funds abroad. If you own property abroad, you can bring proof that you own property. You think broadly. What evidence can you use to show that you really do intend to return to Canada or Mexico at the end of your TN visa? That being said, you can renew a TN visa indefinitely, as long there's no limit. You can have a TN visa that you renew for a decade, and that is generally okay. There's no prohibition on that in the law. You're typically not going to receive questions about your intent, whether you actually plan to leave the US, until you've renewed the TN 3 or 4 times when you're looking at like 8, 9 years in the US on a TN. That's when the government will oftentimes start asking questions about your intent to leave. But before that, usually they're not going to give you a hard time about your intent to leave. All right. Well, I think we addressed all of the questions. I do appreciate you all for taking the time. Please do keep an eye out for that email I mentioned at the start of the presentation where you can schedule a consultation to talk through any specific questions you have about your circumstances. We hope to see you on future webinars. And we also, in the meantime, hope that you find our YouTube channel and blog helpful. Please reach out if you need anything at all. Thanks so much. Stay well in the meantime.